Welcome to BIOMES, almost the second to last before spring break, so welcome. You guys are doing well. My name is Gabriel. I'm a second-year PhD student in the Applied Wildlife Ecology Lab, co-chair of the BIOMES committee, along with the Dean's Office, Melanie, Lori, and Joan, who do an amazing job. Today we have Paul Sabin with us. Paul Sabin is the Randolph W. Townsend Jr. Professor of History at Yale University, where he teaches and writes about environmental and energy history in U.S. political and legal history. He is the faculty director for the Yale Environmental Humanities Program and coordinates the Yale Environmental History Working Group. Sabin's most recent book, Public Citizens, The Attack on Big Government and the Remaking of American Liberalism, examines the evolution and impact of public interest environmental law movement in the United States since the 1960s. His earlier books include The Bet, Paul Ehrlich, Julian Simon, and Our Gamble Over Earth's Future, and Crude Politics, the California Oil Market, 1900 to 1940. Sabin received his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and then spent a year as a Newcomen postdoctoral fellow in business history at the Harvard Business School. He also served for 9 years as the founding executive director of the nonprofit Environmental Leadership Program, which has trained and supported a collaborative network, more than 1,500 talented public leaders from higher education, government, business, and nonprofit organizations. Please help me welcome Paul Sabin.
Do I have two mics going here, or is just one? Okay, I'm just going to talk from this mic. Thanks so much for having me here today, and thanks everybody for coming out. And for those of you who are wondering what this talk is even about, I want to just explain briefly that by NIMBY, I'm talking about not in my backyard, local resistance to various kinds of development projects. YIMBY, on the other hand, is a newer term for yes in my backyard, which is a more proactive encouragement of a variety of different kinds of activities. And what I want to do with you today is to explore shifting attitudes on these issues in the United States since the late 1960s and early 1970s, and some of the issues and questions that I think we need to wrestle with today. And for those of you who do follow these issues closely, I just want to say that I'm using the NIMBY-YIMBY framing broadly to represent some different modes of thinking rather than narrowly applying them to housing or another single issue. So let me start here at home with a few details about New Haven highways in the early 1960s. In the early 60s, New Haven was presented with two proposals for spur highways coming off the new interstates through the city. One of the access roads, Route 34, cut through New Haven along what was a former stream bed that would later turned into a road, the Oak Street corridor. And the Oak Street connector ran to the edge of the city, facilitating suburban access to New Haven and helping to connect the suburbs to the interstates. The first part was completed in 1959, which you can see here. And the second part, and you can see it on the map here, and the second part was completed in the late 1960s. The Oak Street connector represented an ambitious vision for New Haven's future at the time. The city would clear out a rundown, quote, slum and redevelop it. And the spur highway would provide access to center city institutions like the New Haven Coliseum, the hospital district, and downtown shopping. The highway, I think, in many people's view, has been devastating, dividing the city for the past 50 years, wrecking a neighborhood and replacing it with a pretty lifeless wasteland of parking lots, speeding cars, and unwelcoming streetscapes. And today, if you go down to that area, as I'm sure many of you have, New Haven's now spending millions of dollars trying to awkwardly knit the city back together again. At the same time, in the early 1960s, another highway connector was proposed on the other side of the city. The depressed four-lane highway would have run along the base of East Rock, exiting near the Whitney Dam. This highway connector would have provided swift access from the new Interstate 91 to Whitney Avenue and the neighboring towns of Hamden, Cheshire, and beyond. This access road, of course, for those of you who wander the park over there, was never constructed, and for locals, the highway connector Route 40 at exit 10 is what was built instead. So what happened to it? In the spring of 1964, Roger Masters, who was an assistant professor in Yale's political science department, organized a citizens campaign to block the proposal. Masters lived near East Rock Park, and according to the Yale Daily News, Masters was, quote, horrified to discover that the Mill River was to be channeled into a ditch between the lanes of a superhighway. Masters organized a Save the Park committee to fight the highway proposal, enlisting the support of local civic groups, including bird clubs, garden clubs, the teachers union, and other groups. In addition to these two highway connectors, New Haven also considered a third proposal to build an inner ring highway around New Haven, encircling most of Yale and downtown. So here's a map of that. And we would be sitting just outside the loop, which would have skirted around the Grove Street Cemetery. And you can see where Croon Hall is and Broadway and the Grove Street Cemetery up there. I start with these local highway proposals from the 1960s to remind us of the context in which provisions for environmental review and citizen participation were embraced at the end of the 1960s and the beginning of the 1970s. Convinced that highways and automobiles needed unfettered access and represented the future, the Connecticut State Highway Commission sought to impose highways on urban neighborhoods and public parks. And what the Highway Commission proposed to do in East Rock and succeeded in doing with the Oak Street Route 34 connector happened all over the country. Unless this particular design of this interloop highway seemed completely insane to you and fanciful, other cities like Rochester, New York, built exactly this kind of ring highway that was proposed in New Haven. And Rochester is now dismantling that highway and trying to fill it in and replace it with the street level grades and housing and things like that. The urban highway boom is, I think, suggestive of the insularity of agencies from public pressures. While the New Haven's Loop and the East Rock connectors were never built, defeating these proposals required extensive public mobilization. In 1956, for example, a separate proposal to reroute Route 5, State Street through East Rock Park, brought out 1,200 people to Hill House High School in protest. And these stories also show the important and differential power of neighborhoods to shape development. The lower income, more racially diverse Oak Street neighborhood was razed down to the ground for the connector, while the more well-off East Rock, with its large houses and Yale professors, and yes, I live over there, successfully fended off development. And the two outcomes further differentiated the historical paths of the two New Haven communities. So what I want to do during the rest of my time today is exploratory in the spirit of asking some questions and framing a kind of dilemma and puzzle that I see in American governance. And I particularly look forward to some Q&A discussion. So the overarching questions are these. What were some of the key assumptions about economic development, governance, and political representation that characterize the new standards for environmental review and the involvement of local citizens in decisions about development projects? How have these ideas changed in more recent years? And what are some of the challenges of reconciling these competing viewpoints and these different moments in history? And I'm talking predominantly here about the United States, though we can think about how it applies elsewhere. So what do I mean by environmental review and citizen participation? Again, I'm not planning to get into the minutia of the law today, but this generally was represented, for example, by the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, and also state environmental quality acts. Connecticut has one, the California Environmental Quality Act. And these included requirements that public agencies complete detailed reports studying the environmental impact of their actions, and setting the expectation that through public hearings and public engagement, a broad set of individuals and organizations would have the opportunity to comment on and dispute those plans, including through litigation. But I'm also referring even more broadly here to other kinds of review and participation requirements and expectations, including the public consultation that you often see around urban projects, including housing, including right here in New Haven. But rather than the specifics of the law, as a historian, what I want to do is talk about the kinds of assumptions that were behind these policies and how they've changed. These assumptions have changed more recently. So first is just the very idea of creating these new processes to mandate environmental impact statement. In the late 1960s, there was a growing recognition that the federal government increasingly shaped the economy and the environment through mechanisms that lay outside of the formal budgeting process, outside of formal spending. And this understanding of this growth in government power resulted in a series of efforts to better review and manage federal activities, ensuring that they served a broader public interest. And an example of this outside the environmental realm is that of the 1969 tax reform bill, which incorporated the then novel idea that federal tax breaks, tax expenditures, constituted a form of government spending. And the reformers argued that an effective and equitable tax system had to budget more transparently for these kinds of expenditures, including tax deductions for mortgage interest, oil drilling, charitable gifts, and state and local tax payments. So the National Environmental Policy Act, which passed Congress in 1969, took aim at this, at similarly a kind of unaccounted for costs of federal actions, and no longer would the federal government be able to make decisions about building dams and airports and highways as if they had no environmental costs. And court rulings from the time similarly asserted that the public interest could not be calculated solely on economic grounds, but should include the environment, among other things. And this change also reflected ideas about governance, including a kind of a reaction to the growing power of federal agencies since the New Deal. Their increasing power and their also their discretion. Agencies were perceived as captured by powerful economic constituencies. You can think here of the highway lobby, or sometimes called the road gang, which allied with the Highway Commission and the transportation committees to control highway finance and block funding for mass transit and to boost highway construction. So they were seen as captured, or alternately they were seen as bureaucratic forces, isolated, coming up with their own internal ideas, a vision of the future, and then imposing it on society, with the classic representation of this being Robert Moses in Robert Caro's book, The Power Broker, which was published in 1974, sort of an epitome of some of the thinking and writing of that time. The environmental lawyer David Sieve said kind of summarized these kinds of sentiments at the Natural Resource Defense Council's founding conference in March 1970, when he said, quote, "The Federal Power Commission is power-oriented, the Atomic Energy Commission is atom-oriented, the Interstate Commerce Commission is railroad-oriented. The general interest must often fight not only the developer, which may be a private company, but also the very government agency which is supposed to regulate that company, but because of the nature of things, does not represent the broad public interest, general interest." So that was for agencies, but similar sentiment for elected representatives. Why wouldn't the elected representatives, nominally representing the people, why wouldn't they represent the public interest? Well, there was a broad critique of the electoral system at that time, the corruption of campaign finance. Groups like Common Cause founded around then, an idea of the electoral system as corrupted, the parties as corrupted, with the book Who Runs Congress, published in 1972, laying out a lot of these ideas and then leading to various reforms inside the U.S. Congress. And similarly, as part of that, there was a sense of corporate dominance over politics and over political representatives, with one classic examples of this being Wayne Aspinall, who was from Colorado. He was a powerful Democratic congressman and chair of the House Committee on Interior and Insular Affairs. And Aspinall's backers included Kennecott Copper, Shell Oil, Humble Oil, and a mining company that later became a subsidiary of Freeport-McMoRan. So in this context, there was a sense that unheard voices, unheard perspectives meant unrepresented interest in policymaking, in the policymaking process, and so therefore you had to open it up. You had to open up this process to more public input. And this wasn't just in the environmental arena. It's also a broader rights movement, a sense of litigation that was occurring across a variety of other areas, including on poverty issues, on various kind of ethnic and racial issues, women's rights, disability rights, the disability rights movement, leading ultimately up to the American for Disabilities Act, and mental health, other issues like that. So also, why make it harder to proceed just generally with development projects? I think there was a sense at the time of development, economic development being out of control, that in cities there was something called a growth machine, as Harvey Mollich wrote in an essay in 1976. You also have the rampant pollution and degradation of the air, the land, the water, as represented by smog in Los Angeles, the lighting of a fire on a river in the Cuyahoga River with oil debris, the eutrophication of Lake Erie, and the sense of communities being ripped apart by government and private power, including examples like those highways I was telling you about, or redevelopment programs and other broader sense of industrial pollution. So overall, just to summarize some of these key assumptions from the period, without mandates and intervention, the environment and community would not be considered adequately in decisions. that public agencies and institutions could be captured by industry, or they could be bullheaded and misdirected. Elected officials represent powerful interests, not necessarily the broad public. Private interests seek private gain over the broad public interest and less powerful. You have concentrated electoral, private, and bureaucratic power that tends towards abuses and therefore needs to be dissipated and broken apart into smaller groups with the rise of the nonprofit movement. And overall, the idea that applied science and technology was dangerous, and you have lots of stories about radiation and chemicals and pollution from that time, and all of this leading to the solution that of expanded procedures for environmental review and public participation, all of this to provide a counterforce to the discretionary power of agencies, of private economic interests, and the power of elected officials. And these were all opportunities for intervention by unrepresented interests to challenge these powerful groups. So what I've been laying out so far is maybe for many of you a familiar history, but I think it's really necessary to lay the groundwork here to place it in contrast with today. And so what about now? Where today, where the 60s and 70s activists sought to protect against destructive forces, today the status quo is seen as a disaster. If we just keep on doing what we're doing, we're going to end into, with climate and other things, we're going to end in a disastrous situation. Is the idea that we urgently need to build, we urgently need to change, and you see the passage of these recent laws, the Infrastructure Bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Bill, all as representatives of this. And this then poses a new dilemma, which Ezra Klein recently characterized on his show just a couple weeks ago. Liberalism is going to need to build a lot of stuff in the real world. It needs to build houses, clean energy capacity, transmission lines, mass transit, semiconductor manufacturing facilities, child care centers, all this stuff, all these buildings, all this infrastructure. Can it actually do that? And so this is the question that people are asking, and the question is, why can't Americans build? And the new analysis increasingly blames this very 1960s and 70s liberalism that I've been describing the groundwork for, these procedural obstacles, these veto points, these delays, this litigation, not in my backyard, NIMBYism as the problem, and yes in my backyard as the solution. Now, there's a particular focus with YIMBY around housing, where existing homeowner coalitions use an array of legal and political tools to block the construction of multifamily units, apartment buildings, and you can see that here in New Haven and elsewhere, particularly strongly in California, with a great social anxiety about the costs, about these costs, and a pressure to do something about it, and this then leads to a rejection of local control over zoning and parking, often for state mandates, or the idea that developers should have discretion. The idea that there's a different voiceless group out there, homeowners and renters that aren't being heard, and so their voice is unrepresented, that change is necessary, stasis is unacceptable, and a recharacterization of developers as creators of a public good, of housing, of jobs, rather than the profit-seeking neighborhood destroyers that they often were characterized in a previous generation. So important aspect of this is the rejection of the idea of community participation as representative, as constructive to the process. So now in a reversal, you see representative democracy is being held up and participatory democracy is being cited as being the problem. So the question is, why don't we just let our elected officials do what they were elected to do and not allow these neighborhood associations and other groups participate in community input and represent a narrow set of interests. So this is Jerusalem's Demsas in the Atlantic. So this is a very striking reversal of 70s participation, that it's the idea that it's powering the wrong people and preventing the creation of public goods. You see a similar creation of criticism of environmental review, and these are these aren't abstract issues. Just yesterday, I think it was the Republicans introduced a new permitting bill in Congress, and there's an article in Politico about it. So these are things that are being argued about right now. But now environmental review being characterized as a tool of the powerful, an entrenched interest, a primary obstacle to the creation of public goods, housing, transit, renewable energy, transmission. And so the permitting reform of Manchin's proposal as seen as necessary, and that the only way the Inflation Reduction Act is going to be, its potential will be fulfilled is with permitting reform. This idea was captured recently in in the fall by a post on the Institute for Progress website called "How to Stop Environmental Review from Harming the Environment." And just imagine going back to 1970 or I guess the first uses of NEPA and the idea that environmental review is harming the environment, and just to get a sense, kind of thinking about this reversal. But here they are arguing that the NEPA process is slowing down the clean energy transition, is long overdue for reform. It imposes massive costs, drags clean energy projects out for years, generates uncertainty that stops other projects from ever getting off the ground. Similarly, just this week, or I guess it was last week now, Governor Gavin Newsom put out a press release denouncing the California Environmental Quality Act for being weaponized to block student housing, saying that the CEQA process is clearly broken. California cannot afford to be held hostage by NIMBYs who weaponize CEQA to block student and affordable housing. This selfish mindset is driving up housing prices and making our state less affordable. So all this is placed in the context of the climate crisis, leading to a striking reversal of many of those assumptions that I laid out in the first part of the talk. Ideas about a new liberal embrace of power, an embrace of change, a critique of participation, a critique of review, an embrace of agency power, a rejection of too much weight being given to aesthetics, an embrace of technology, a rejection of the local, etc. So, what to do? How to reconcile these conflicts within liberalism? Well, there are a couple main strategies that I've been seeing more recently. Strategy one is rhetorically, to some extent, a return to the pre-NIMBY regime. The idea that NEPA, maybe it was good back then, but it's the problem now. You often hear a nostalgia for the creation, the construction of the interstate highway, the construction of the transcontinental railroad, the building up of the infrastructure of the grid, the big dams. You could build that then, but we could never build that now. That kind of rhetoric, and there's like an undercurrent of this. Maybe Robert Moses was right. Can't create public goods like beaches and parks and roads and other kinds of infrastructure without administrative force and administrative discretion. So that's one perspective. And I'm broadly characterizing these. A second would be to defend the legal regime, basically assert that it's not broken. And say that community-based activism depends on these tools, particularly citing environmental justice organizing and local activists. Also, a dispute of the nature of the problem. Saying is NEPA permitting? Is that really to blame? And various competing studies of what kinds of delays and costs are associated with that. And then there's also an attack on. An assertion that the attack on environmental review is basically just a front for industrial interests, and Manchin's effort to push through the Mountain Valley pipeline over years of grassroots opposition to it as part of the permitting bill is often held up as a representative of this. So I want to discuss also, though, a third strategy, which is to acknowledge the legitimacy of the tensions between these perspectives and these different moments, these different eras in history, and to think about the ways that these tensions illuminate competing insights that we need to try to find some way to hold together. So this is the ideas about how elected officials do represent the broad public, but also the democracy is badly flawed. Private interests, private money dominate our electoral system, and we can roll out many examples of how that might be the case. That environmental regulation and review are necessary, but at the same time, these legal tools also are burdensome, and they also can be exploited. That renewable energy infrastructure is desperately needed, but at the same time, it also is industrial development that can disrupt habitat, landscapes, and communities. So I think that these tensions raise a broader question about whether it's possible to sustain complexity in our polarized climate. And can liberals, I'm mostly talking here about kind of tensions within liberalism, can they wrestle with these tensions? Can you hold these different competing ideas together? In the late 1970s, the Carter administration struggled to do just that. They struggled to balance an active regulatory state with a focus on government efficiency and building trust in government. And the administration's effort at that time was related to what I see as, blank slide. The administration's effort was related to what I see as another 1960s, 70s insight, and I mentioned previously the idea of off-budget expenditures and costs, that led to the tax reform. But this insight also was it can be extended further to the idea of administrative burdens and regulatory costs. The idea that regulation was not free. Agencies could impose administrative or regulatory costs. They could impose administrative or regulatory mandates on citizens and businesses without any concern for the time and money that these mandates would require. And so the idea then was that regulations, just like tax deductions and also infrastructure projects, that they had costs that needed to be calculated and managed. Regulation had such a, quote, pervasive impact, a Carter advisor argued in 1979, that it needed to be reconceptualized as a planning and management tool rather than a piecemeal solution to pollution, safety, and efficiency problems. Carter's willingness to experiment with emissions trading, for example, the idea of a bubble for air pollution, which they start to experiment with in the late 70s, things like that, emissions trading, that was a part of an effort to try to achieve environmental improvements at reduced cost. In December 1980, Carter signed the Paperwork Reduction Act. And people often associate paperwork reduction and regulatory reform with the Reagan administration. But Carter actually enthusiastically embraced it, and he saw it as part of his legacy. Now, critics of Carter's turn towards deregulation and regulatory reform and cost-benefit analysis, maybe symbolized by paperwork reduction, they often cite this as an indication of his incipient Reaganite tendencies, the beginning of neoliberalism, that Carter was just kind of paving the way for Reagan. But I think that's a mistake. Carter signed, when he signed that bill, he signed it in December 1980, and he paired the two bills together on that same morning in December 1980. He paired the Paperwork Reduction Act with the signing of the Superfund law, which is the hazardous waste management law. And I think that was really important for trying to understand the kind of governance that he was trying to develop. Because he spoke then about how each of these two bills represented a passion for him. Protecting the environment, and also making government more efficient and effective. Unfortunately, Carter's aspiration to hold these two things together as competing but shared goals failed politically. Rather than embrace the tension between government action and reform, advocates chose sides in the early 1980s, as if there could only be one or the other. Critics from the left, and this actually even started in the late Carter years, denounced regulatory cost analysis as simply a, quote, power play by corporations. It was part of a, quote, business war on the law, which is the title of a book that the Nader organization put out. And Carter advisors who advocated attention to regulatory costs were called, quote, economic gunslingers who wanted to, quote, trade lives for dollars. So that was one side, the criticism of these ideas. On the other side, the criticism of the environmental activity, you had anti-regulatory ideologues like David Stockman from Michigan, who then becomes the head of the Office of Management and Budget, who wrote just days after this double signing that Carter did. He called for a, quote, regulatory ventilation that would block or reverse the environmental protections that had been passed in the 1970s. And I think that one of the great ironies of the Reagan presidency that is, I think, little understood is that it actually wrecked any hope of a bipartisan coalition for regulatory reform because it turned it into an attack on the regulatory state on the one hand, and a kind of a pure, unvariegated defense of it on the other. And it ultimately brought deregulation and regulatory reform more to a halt than accelerate it. And so the increasingly polarized climate made it more difficult to reform the environmental legislation of the 1970s, to see where there might be flaws and weaknesses and how it might be able to operate better, because there was no trust that if you open these laws up, that there was a good faith effort to try to reform them to continue to accomplish their goals. And you see that right now with the NEPA debate, with permitting reform characterized, perceived by I think many on the left as a sellout to people who've been calling for NEPA reform since NEPA was passed, and fossil fuel companies and others, on the other side, I think you see NEPA as being denounced as unnecessary, misguided, and you have this nostalgia for a pre-NIMBY legal environment of the 1960s, as if all those things that I talked about at the beginning of the lecture never happened, and that all those concerns and considerations about agencies, about representation, about the system, as all that won't happen again, or that those aren't aspects of the political system. So at least here, I know out in the advocacy world, people may take more strident positions and choose sides more definitively, but at least here, I think in the university setting, I think we have to wrestle with these complexities and try to navigate our way through them, rather than simply choose one side or the other, ally ourselves with the 1970s or another period, while denying the clear insights that I think support the competing positions. So I'm going to close here. We have a bunch of time, and I really look forward to hearing your questions and ideas. I think these are difficult issues to wrestle with, and I'm not presenting the answers, but I do have a lot of questions for you, and look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thanks.
Questions?
Yeah.
Paul, thanks for a great thought-provoking talk. I wonder, just an idea occurs to me, the transition from the perspective that you have on the participatory process as being advocating for environmental protection, as opposed to changing to sort of seeming that the participatory process works against it. I wonder if another, at least a hypothesis I'd put forth, is the environmental issues that we're concerned about now tend to be different than they were back then, in the sense that they're for benefits that accrue globally in the case of climate change and not just to the local community. So now locals may bear the cost, whereas the benefits are beyond. It seems like the scale of the problem actually could affect how you think of these two sides lining up as being pro-environmental or not.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. With the climate example as one that pitting climate against endangered species protection. Climate as a global issue, species protection as a more local or situated issue. I think that is an excellent point. And I guess in the spirit of thinking about holding the tensions together, I guess I just say that just because climate has emerged doesn't mean that some of the earlier issues that they don't exist too, and that what we need to find is some kind of way of figuring out how we're going to navigate the mess of balancing these competing questions. Just on your comment also made me think of a second point to make, which is that one of the things that was learned about community participation after it was embraced by the public interest movement in the early 1970s is that the liberal of public interest organizations don't have a monopoly on what the public interest is, and you also start to quickly see many others using these tools, and it really you see in some ways a displacement of the fights that happen in other arenas into the public participation arena, and you see the emergence of conservative public interest law firms, including groups like the Mountain States Legal Foundation that James Watt helped to start, as also embracing in an environmental litigation strategies to fight takings provisions and other things like that. But I think that's a very important point of thinking about how the issues have changed, and that is changing how people think about the different voices and interests.
Thanks, Paul, for a very informative talk. I wanted to pick up on your emphasis on complexities in the tensions, and when I think of complexities, I move towards consciousness, also namely awareness, and understanding of the complexities. Could you say a word about education in this regard? It seems education itself of these complex issues is diminished, and also our media is unable to really bring us to some insight consistently.
That's a good question. Well, we're here in a university setting, and I think that this does highlight for me the importance of argument and wrestling with these kinds of difficult issues in a setting. And here we are in the environment school, and we're talking about an attack on NEPA, the foundational environmental law in the United States, and I think there's just a real need in educational settings for us to be willing to open up the box and look in it and see what's there, and be willing to try those things out. And I think that we do live in a moment, I think, when there is a tendency to see what's happening on campuses and in our classrooms as just a mere extension of what's happening in the broader political environment. So I guess as a faculty member, as somebody committed to the educational process and the classroom as a place for learning, I do think it's important to try to. Of course, we can acknowledge the ways that the university is a political environment, a political setting. But I think at the same time, I think it's important to really hold dear to the ways in which the university can create a bubble, can create a place where we can really argue about these things and try to make sense of them, because I think we have to. But I think the other question that you said was about the media, broader media environment. And I guess I would say that just relates to what I was just saying, which is that I think that we live in a broader media context right now that is one of conflict and simplification and choosing sides. And I think that we need to find a way to create an educational environment here on the campus, where we can argue about this. And so part of the reason for me to basically present the arguments for both sides and the supporting evidence for both sides is to show how difficult it is, and that these aren't simple answers to this. And again, I'm not going to pretend to say what the law should be for NEPA and permitting reform, but undoubtedly there's something that we need to talk about here. Yeah, Marianne.
So in the New Haven Register, thank you. In the New Haven Register this week, there's been a article about the waste issues in Connecticut, and they seem to really resonate with how you laid out the talk in the beginning. And I know you said don't pick one thing, but this is I think also a broader thing. And Representative Mary Mashinsky, who's been with this for decades, reminded us that in the 70s and 80s we planned out a whole system to manage waste. We were the envy of the country, and it involved having waste to energy plants and closing landfills because we have a high water table here, and so we created the system and then built recycling plants and then set laws about composting and so forth. And 35 years later, the heart of the system is old and falling down. The waste to energy plants that, frankly, I was the president of the bonding authority, so I guess I remember a little bit about it. And so now in this age that you're describing, what we're having is that all of the Hartford area waste, millions of tons, is being taken in trucks to Ohio and Pennsylvania. With a two-way trip, a round trip is 1,000 miles, and there's nowhere to put our trash, and there's no foresight to see what it could be in the beginning. Largely because of the concerns of mayors who don't want to look and be accused of any violations. There's more pollution, and we've created that pollution after having had a pretty rational way to do it. And so I turn back to you And I say, this crippling is unbelievable. The people won't get housing because we can't agree on that. We can't agree on where to put the waste, and so and so and so and so and so. So there you go.
Here I am. So yeah, let's see. Well, I mean, I think that I think that there is a real question about the ability of the government to act effectively. I don't know, I guess that's what you're talking about, and you know, whether the system's working effectively. And you know, just yesterday there was a long hearing at the Connecticut State Legislature about housing and you know, about affordable housing, and that's very much in the narrower area of NIMBY and YIMBY, but related to zoning and other restraints, but. Something's got to give in terms of building more housing for people in the state of Connecticut. But anyway, I don't exactly know how to build, you know, respond exactly to your comment, except just to say that I think we, you know, I guess a point I wanted to make is that the ability of government to act needs to be act efficiently and effectively. Needs to be held as a goal, as an aspiration that we pursue, and trying to figure out how to do that. I think there was a question over here, maybe.
Yeah, think like currently, like we think maybe if you think about the issue, you know, about climate change, it seems like there's certain, you know, technologies we should build that are sort of quite obvious and helpful, but maybe there's, you know, like local pushback. And sort of to slightly, like if we're trying to be very sort of thoughtful and cautious about that, like sort of in history, like you gave these sort of horrific examples of like building these highways that just seem really bad idea, but maybe they seemed like a really good idea to academics, you know, people thinking about it at the time. Like, are there lessons we can draw for how do we, like, you know, if we look back, are we going to think that our ideas now are good, or are we getting stuff wrong again? Like, are there lessons about how we can think about that? And I guess in the context of more global issues.
That's a great question, and that's where the history department comes in. I think that you know, certainly one aspect, you know, humility is something that we certainly preach about, and unintended consequences and paradoxes, and you know, uncertainty about how some things are going to turn out, and you know, and while some of the solutions may seem just so patently obvious that that we might have no questions about them, you know, others. You know, you can go anywhere from, I don't know, I guess the you know, the clear value of, you know, putting solar panels on, you know, industrial warehouses, to the very uncertain value of spreading aerosols in the atmosphere and trying to geoengineer the planet. And obviously those are on quite different scale. But you know, we can see other areas where I don't know. This is maybe not environmental, but you know, I've just been fascinated by the boom in artificial intelligence just in the last you know, last several months, and you know, just thinking about the uncertainties about technology, those things that people worried about, you know, related to nuclear things in the 1950s and 60s. You know, we can worry about there are things that we have to worry about, you know, too. I think that another point that I guess I'd make about this is slightly different, which has to do with industrial siting, because I think that there's and this maybe goes back to the initial question about local interests and local environmental problems. Many of these are industrial facilities, industrial, you know, transmission lines, and you know, other types of industrialization of rural landscapes. And there's a bit of a rhetorical move right now, which is basically that in the interest of solving climate, we have to just brush everything else out of the way. Aesthetics no longer matter. You know, rural landscape preservation doesn't really matter that much. In the broad sweep of things, we have this overarching thing, and I think you can make, you know, I can understand that argument, and we do, like, have to build. You know, we need these things. At the same time, I think that there is maybe some value in there being, at least a little bit of pushback in the system towards, cutting down, or turning green fields into industrial energy producing sites, as opposed to pushing people to, pushing all of these, like I said, these warehouses and parking lots and other places to put solar panels on all of those. But if there's no pushback, there's no tension there, there's no representation of this continued environmental values that are represented by these other landscapes, then there won't be, there won't be as much encouragement to consider a range of different kinds of other options as well, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
Thanks. I think it's fascinating that the talk centered on NIMBY and YIMBY as two kind of antithetical categories that have shifted over time. And I think that you've been quite successful in showing us how. In terms of environmental values, I wonder about what categories of homeownership, land, if we think about land as an environmental value and not just a thing, and think about that more, would it help us come to historical conclusions better about what happened in the last 30 years? Because as a non-homeowner listening to the talk, I don't know where I sit as a character potentially in this story. And I see as like a reader, audience member, in what happened is that the values began to be defined in these debates around homeowners and land as nation in a time when climate change became a global problem and people's position in participatory governance or representative governance changed. And so as a reader, audience member, I kind of want to know more about the category of land within and kind of the political economy of this moment. Because it does seem like if we're going to go in the YIMBY direction in the future, yes, in my backyard, we need to build. This is all premised on a kind of growth economy that positions nation and land within a broader kind of movement for power on the global level. And so,
right. Well, I'm not sure about the global aspect of it, but certainly it is premised on both a recognition of growth, that we have had population growth and but not had housing commensurate with it, or maybe in the state of Connecticut we want to have population growth, but we don't have places for people to live and to draw them in here. I think that So where does the renter fit into the story? I mean, I think part in the YIMBY, I think part of the idea is that the renter is an unrepresented voice, and that may be off stage and needs to, but is a future resident of a place potentially, and that they need to have their perspective. So the people who want to live, I don't know, in an apartment building downtown, they may not live there now, but they want to live there, and this is essentially giving voice to them. But it is a growth mentality, and the idea. So in some ways, it's going back again to I talked about the growth machine as a bad thing in the 70s, that was the idea of all these urban interests, pressing to grow, to increase their for profit and power, and the pushback against that. But this is a seeing that actually there is an alliance of potential interests between future residents and the people who are building the housing. I'm not sure that's totally an answer to your question. We can talk about it more afterwards. Mary Evelyn.
Paul, thanks so much for your talk and your work. I wanted to just draw you out, both with John's question on education and this question on land value, actually, because I'd love to have you speak a little bit about environmental humanities. You've been working with it and directing it 5 years, but I'm not sure all of our students know how robust environmental humanities are at Yale. Over 160 classes, lots of programs and so on. And I think that there's a way in which it relates to some of the questions, including Marion's and so on, how we think in broader ways. Not that we're going to find the way, the truth, and the light. But could you just give our audience a little bit more of a feeling of what is happening in environmental humanities, which is probably the most robust program in the country?
Well, Well, that's very nice of you to ask. Sure. I mean, we do have an extraordinary community of people working in the humanities and interested in the environment at Yale, including folks in English and history and anthropology and history of art and even music. The Institute for Sacred Music has just started a whole new initiative at the intersection of religion and music and the arts. And I guess if I wanted to characterize sort of the assertion of the program is just that these environmental problems are not simply able to be solved just with policy and economics and law, but actually that they're fundamentally humanistic problems. And part of what I've been trying to show here today is just for an example of how history can be used to bring some greater depth and understanding to the issues that we're struggling with. And I think and so part of the goal of the environmental humanities is bring us up to be more equal partners with the sciences and the social sciences and considering environmental issues. And we have there's 200 events in the environmental humanities every year on campus at Yale. So if you're interested in that, we do have a weekly newsletter that goes out on Monday, and encourage you all to sign up for it. It has all the events that are coming in the next two weeks. Usually there are dozens of them, and I encourage you to think about this because of the various ways that the humanities shape our approach to environmental problems. But thanks. Any other questions?
One here, and then maybe one more.
A couple times during your talk, you talked about, well, first the governor of California, who's in his statement about the Berkeley housing, I think mentioned specifically wealthy homeowners who had blocked it. At the beginning, you also talked about New Haven, where the disadvantaged community, the more racially diverse community, wasn't able to block the highway, but the wealthier ones, including near East Rock, were. I'm wondering if you know of any efforts to design proposals to reform these environmental laws that would sort of allow disadvantaged communities to continue to have a greater say or be more prioritized, knowing that wealthier communities, less racially diverse communities, have probably more tools at their disposal to make their voices heard. Or even if you don't know of efforts, do you think that's a possible way that we could think about reforming these rules?
That's a great question. And again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm a historian, but I think that there has been an effort in recent years to define what's called environmental justice communities as a kind of a category defined in various different ways, and to, once that definition has been established, to then dedicate different kinds of resources or opportunities. So EPA grants, other types of funding, dedicating certain portions of programs. So that's more, a lot of it is financial, but I think and again, I should know that, but don't. But I think that is, I think there has been an effort to try to do that. That's a good question.
Hi, thank you, Professor Sabin. You talked about the change in political polarization when it comes to environmental issues. And compared to, 50, 60 years ago when you had Republican administrations passing what we see now as really progressive environmental legislation, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, today it's like there's a complete 180 in the approach of environmental issues between administrations. And in this kind of climate, when you can see between administrations, their treatment of these issues so differently, we've seen environmental regulation and legislation be kind of a protection in times of administrations that are opposed to environmental issues, like the Trump administration. And in your proposal, when we rethink how environmental regulation works, how do you think about the risk that comes with that under an administration that is opposed to environmental and regulation, and when loosening regulation could mean, potentially devastating things like pipelines, et cetera? So how do you think about the risk of that?
No, I mean that does pose the dilemma, which is part of why I do distinguish a little bit between the conversations that we're going to have here and thinking about how they get played out in the broader, political context. But that's the issue of, if you open up NEPA for reform, what will be left of it afterwards? That question. I mean, I think that it's important in thinking about the history of polarization related to the environment. A couple of things are just worth noting. One is the way in which it tracks onto just the broader sifting out of the political parties and kind of a reshaping of the political coalitions. And so it's not exactly that the people who favor the environment before stopped it, but more that the parties have become different things, and that has also mapped onto their environmental policies, and environmental policies mapping onto ideas about the role of government in the United States. But a second point that I think is important to make is just the enduring strength of the environmental protections of the 1970s. I mean, clean water, clean air, those remain as extremely popular, and efforts to diminish the existing protections there, I think, have generally not been successful. What's proven more difficult, going back again to the first point, is the changing nature of environmental problems has been more challenging. A large global problem projected over the course of decades or even centuries, generated by abstract computer models, like climate change has been harder to develop political coalition around than the immediate issues of smog and pollution, a fire on a river in the Cuyahoga River, things like that. Anyway, those are an aside. I think that I guess my hope is that by wrestling with the tensions, we can try to move to a space. The pressures of our politicized climate, push us away from that space. People, end up in their camps. So I guess the challenge is to try to push towards this other ground and try to operate there. And I think there are people, even elected officials, who want to be there, but struggle to get to that place.
Thank you. Please help me thank Dr.
All right,
Sabin one more
thanks.
time.